it's a tough thing to put your finger on, but basically, I would say that creativity is bringing something into being which didn't previously exist, which has some kind of intrinsic value.
In this week's episode, I interview Richard Holman. Richard is a creative coach and also the author of this new book, Creative Demons and How to Slay Them. In the interview, he talks all about the 10 creative demons, which many of us can fall prey to. And it was so interesting hearing his advice on how to overcome any roadblocks that you might have. We also talk about how you define creativity and how some people are more creative than others. And his 3 tips at the end are so valuable. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Richard. A very warm welcome, Richard, to the My Small Business and Me podcast.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to join you today, Verona.
It's so lovely to meet you after reading your incredibly resonating article in The Telegraph, which you wrote in February. Tell us a little bit about that.
As we'll get onto in our conversation, you know, my thing is helping people to feel more confident creatively. And through somebody I know, I was invited to write a piece for The Telegraph, and the sort of the kind of theme they gave me is why you are more creative than you think you are, fundamentally. And the book that I've recently written, Creative Demons and How to Slay Them, is all about how our creativity is kind of limited by these little demons that appear over time. And I think it's really interesting that when kids are preschool, they are boundlessly and effortlessly and fearlessly creative. You know, you take a room full of 5-year-olds, give them some pens and paper, and boom, off they go. But the older we become, the more sort of self-conscious we are, the more sort of fearful we are of being made to look foolish. And so we acquire this kind of personnel of creative demons, and so the Telegraph article really was 1,500 words on some simple things people can do to start to overcome their own creative demons.
And let's talk about your book. If you'd like to show it to the people who are watching on YouTube.
It would be my pleasure. I just happen to
Let's spend some time talking about it, because I so enjoyed reading it. Tell us how you came up with a structure and explain how there are 10 demons. Yeah,
well, do you know what? Honestly, it was maybe a bit more sort of arbitrary than it might suggest now. So with the book, I've written regularly for various publications, and I write articles on my own website and blog about the creative process. And I give talks and stuff. So over the last few years, I'd accumulated enough material for a book. And first, I did a few years back, when I had a quiet period, write a little book that I self-published, which I've also got somewhere. And this book, which...
What's that one called?
It's called Beavers, Outrage and Blossom.
Okay.
A Creative Manifesto. And so I wrote this, and this sort of proved to me that I could write a book, albeit quite a short one. And so I thought, well, I'll have a go at writing a proper book, proper book, meaning one that a publisher publishes and people can buy in shops. So I came up with the sort of the thrust of the book and the content. But I spoke to somebody who used to work in publishing. And at the time I was going to call the book The Wind-Thieved Hat, which is the name of my podcast. And that comes from a little passage I read in a book about Stan Laurel. So, remember Laurel and Hardy?
Yeah.
And this book, it's a novel by John Connolly. And he imagines the sort of interior life of Stan Laurel. And there's this bit where Stan Laurel's trying to write gags and he's struggling. And in the book, John Connolly writes, some days you have to sit back and let inspiration come to you rather than chase after it like a man in pursuit of a wind-thieved hat. And this always stuck with me, because I think the more desperate we are to have a good idea, the more elusive they become, you know. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I was going to call the book The Wind-Thieved Hat. This very wise woman said to me, well, that's nice, but nobody's going to know what your book's about. So you need a snappier title. So I went away and I thought, Creative Demons and How to Slay Them. That's much clearer. People will get what it's about. And it immediately gave me the structure for the book, because then I thought, right, I can name these demons one by one. So I basically just scribbled a list of the 10 demons that I thought were the most prevalent, the most difficult, the most challenging, and kind of the most universal. And that became the structure for the book. And so it was kind of fortunate, really, that I had this conversation. Because I think if I hadn't, then I would have gone to publishers with The Wind-Thieved Hat, and they'd have gone, yeah, it's okay. But that little challenge to me made the whole thing sort of sharper and gave me a structure. And that's one of the reasons why the book is bright red, which I think is quite a nice design thing.
I did pick up on that. So let's talk about, can you just run through the 10 demons as you described them in the chapter?
Yeah, of course. So I begin with the demon of procrastination, which is no accident, because obviously that being the first chapter, I had to battle my own demon of procrastination in getting it written. Then I move on to the demon of the blank page, because again, okay, I've decided to do this thing. What am I going to write? And then the demon of doubt. Am I any good? Is this book any good? As I was writing the book, really, I was kind of living it. The demon of convention is, how do we get out of this rut of doing things like they've always been done? The demon of constraints. I'm limited by. I wrote this book during the pandemic, during the sort of throes of the pandemic. And I'm now sitting in a shed at the bottom of my garden, but I wrote the book at the top of the stairs. And my kids were being homeschooled, and we had some builders doing some work, and it was just, it was challenging. And then the demon of criticism. How do we deal with the critics? The demon of theft, and this whole idea of, is it okay to steal and borrow ideas? The demon of accidents. What to do when something unpredictable happens in your process that you weren't expecting? The demon of failure. I believe that the fear of failure is one of the biggest barriers people face in realizing their creative selves. And then the demon of disappointment. There is inevitably a gulf between this sort of beautiful idea as it was in our heads, and then the somewhat disappointing thing we've executed with our hands. And how should we deal with that gap? So those are the 10.
And which one do you think rears its ugly head the most?
Well, I think it's hard to say, really. I don't think any. I think all of us experience a few of these demons, if not all of them, at some point. And to a degree, I think it depends at what part of the creative process you are at. That will inform how significant one of these demons is to you at that particular moment.
Can we talk about one of my favourite chapters, which is the demon of criticism? And there's 2 or 3 examples which you highlight of incredibly talented people who, well, I'll let you finish off, but there are, if we could touch on 2 or 3 people in particular, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we are all influenced and affected by others' opinions of us and our work. We are social creatures, and as human beings. And I think even, you know, even our greatest artists who produce work in spite of themselves, and they often do it in a solitary way, are still concerned about how the work goes down in the world. You know, you make a painting, it's to hang in a gallery and be seen. You write a book, it's to be read. I guess you create a business, it's for people to walk through the door. So you know, that judgment is a big deal. And one of the surprising things is how people who we deem to be very successful or have been very successful have often been on the receiving end of particularly stinging criticism. So one of the examples I draw on is from a review in the New York Times in 1956, and I won't initially say who this is about.
That's a good idea.
It's about a singer who I can feel 100% confident everybody listening to this podcast has heard about. So X has no discernible singing ability. His specialty is rhythm songs, which he renders in an undistinguished whine. His phrasing, if it can be called that, consists of the stereotyped variations that go with a beginner's aria in a bathroom. For the ear, he is an unutterable bore. This review, which was written by the critic Jack Gould, was of Elvis Presley. He went on to enjoy modest success as a rock and roll star. And you know, there are a few. Fred Astaire made his first screen test for MGM, and his performance was briefly annotated. Can't act, can't sing, slightly bald, can dance a little.
It just astonishes me how, you know, it's such a subjective thing, isn't it? Creativity in certain ways, don't you think?
Yeah, yes, yeah, absolutely. And you know, the critics often get it wrong, and public opinion often gets it wrong. You know, I talk about Van Gogh in the book, and famously only sold one painting in his lifetime. So I think while we are inevitably affected by people's opinions, the trick is not to let yourself get too puffed up when those opinions are really positive, or too down when those opinions are negative. The ultimate arbiter of the value of one's creative endeavors, I think, is you yourself. You know how true you've been to yourself, you know how hard you've worked, you know how faithful you've been to that initial impulse or insight which got you motivated. And I think these are the things that one should use to evaluate one's work, rather than, you know, half-assed opinions conjured up in the middle of the night over a bottle of wine by some fool on Facebook.
So, as well as being an author, what is when you meet somebody for the first time and they say, Richard, what do you do? What do you say?
Well, you know, like a lot of people, I struggle a little bit, and my wife often overhears me, and she goes, "Oh, you know, you should be more confident about how you describe yourself." And I guess now, having a book, I'm just starting to, I'm tentatively using the word author. But I you know, the thing is that I believe that our world needs more creativity now than ever before. You know, I believe that creativity is a good thing. And so I do what I can to help people feel more confident creatively. That's the kind of, you know, my reason for being, and the sort of center of gravity of the different things I do. So I write articles, I give talks and workshops, I do some individual coaching and webinars now and again, and this kind of thing. Just sharing the inspirational stories that I've heard, the insights that I've gained over my own creative career to help people be more creative themselves.
And can you share your journey to now?
Yeah. So I began in television. So my initial aim was to make documentaries, and by dint of circumstance, I was quickly sort of sidetracked into a particular area, which was more about the design and advertising of TV channels. And I landed a job at the BBC as a trainee when I was 24. And that job was, I started off making trailers for programs. And then 4 years later, I was writing the sort of the BBC ads, ads promoting the BBC and like this. And I left because I found the whole sort of bureaucratic monolith that was the BBC didn't really suit me very much. I still love the BBC and everything that it stands for, but it wasn't quite right for me. So I left and I set up my own agency. And I ran a design and an advertising agency for about 10 years, and then finished that, had a little break, set up a business with my wife, making and restoring furniture, which we did here in South Wales. And then over the last few years, I've really focused on the creativity thing, and that is very much my sole focus these days.
So you coach companies and also individuals on creativity, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So I do. The majority of my paying gigs are workshops for companies, and the majority of my clients, largely because of my background, are entertainment brands and TV channels and networks all around the world. So I often work with their in-house creative teams on things like creative confidence, but also copywriting, pitching, taking feedback, these sort of things. And over the past couple of years, I've done more sort of individual coaching and mentoring. So again, sometimes I'm hired by these companies to work with a few individuals, and I take on a few private clients now and again who are mostly creative professionals, to work with them in more bespoke, tailored sessions.
Now, I'd like to drum down on this word, well, two words, creative and creativity, and just share when I used to work in the city for the FT and LexisNexis, and for one reason or another, I retrained as a florist, and I decided to take redundancy and train more and work in the floristry industry. This is over 10 years ago. And I'll never forget, one of my team members, I had a big team, came up to me, I think towards the end of my time there, and she said, "Oh, I understand you're going to floristry." I said, "Yeah." She turned around and she went, "But you're not very creative."
Wow, nice. Thanks for that. Yeah.
That was a bit of a stab to the heart, I can tell
Yeah.
you. How do you define three things? How do you define creativity, and do you think everybody is creative?
So in answer to the first question, how do I define creativity? It's a tough thing to put your finger on, but basically, I would say that creativity is bringing something into being which didn't previously exist, which has some kind of intrinsic value. So you could bring something into being which didn't previously exist, but which was just, accidental or a bit rubbish, or had no value. But genuine creativity is about producing something which has some kind of value. The value isn't necessarily financial or sort of practical or utilitarian. It could be, but it may be artistic value, or it may have value because it is something that you wished to express, which you hadn't previously expressed. So the value can be a lot of different things, but I think fundamentally that's really what creativity is. And creativity, same thing can be applied to a business. When you set up a business, you're bringing an entity into existence which wasn't previously around, and which you hope will have value, and financial, but maybe other kinds of value too. And yeah, everybody is creative, you know. As human beings, we can't help it. You know, we are. We come up with ways of solving small problems all the time. You know, our in our kitchen over the weekend, the thing that we put the pots in when you're drying the dishes. What's that thing called?
Draining rack.
Draining rack. A draining rack. Yeah, the draining rack broke. And so we've had to come up with a sort of innovative way of stacking the pots so that they don't all spill on the floor. It's a tiny instance of human creativity and ingenuity. We do these sort of things all the time. So undoubtedly, some people are more creative than others. And there are those people who just cannot help generate poems and paintings and thoughts all the time. But all of us have it within us. You know, we have between our ears the most complex organ on the planet. You know, we have as many neurons in our brains as there are stars in the Milky Way. And so we can't help it. You know, it's there.
So I hope this isn't going to be a difficult question, but it's interesting how you said some people are more creative than others. How do you judge whether or not one person is creative, but one person's more creative?
Output, really, I think.
Okay.
You know, I have friends who are just endlessly making stuff. You know, I think one of my friends in particular is a chap called Tony who I interviewed on my. He was one of the first interviewees on my podcast, and
I'll put a link to it.
He was in a band. He was in the last band to be signed by Factory Records in.
Oh wow!
And he's now works in TV, but he's writing plays and he does these abstract artworks and he's sending me tunes all the time, and he's just, you know, it just bubbles out of him. So you know, that I guess is where one becomes aware of this kind of, you know, this creative engine working all the time in some people.
So he's creating output which is of value all the time.
Yeah. You know, some of the stuff he makes has got more value than others, as I'm sure he'd admit. But he's one of these people who can't switch off. You know.
Okay.
And you know, but it's a bit of a bell curve, you know, and he's probably at one end, and most of us are in the middle. And I think for a lot of us, you know, the feeling that we're not creative, or somebody saying to us, you know, at a formative stage, you're not creative, and us taking that as a truth can be a real inhibitor. You know, I think so many, you know, it's a tragedy really that so many kids are told by an unthinking art teacher that they can't draw. Yeah. And in fact, really what that art teacher is saying, you've not done that assignment correctly, or you're not drawing like I expect you to draw. But the kid can draw. The kid's just drawing in a different way. But that one comment might be enough to completely arrest any kind of artistic career. So again, this is another reason why one has to be, we have to be wary about listening too carefully to other people's opinions of what we do.
So if somebody is the complete opposite to your friend Tony and they're not creative, but they feel that they want to be, but they're fearful, I'm assuming it's all about creative confidence, which you coach about. How do you coach somebody to be more creative?
Well, it's a good question, Rona. I want you know, spend a long time on. But I guess I would say two things are important. One is that the brain is at its most creative when it's at rest. So modern life is really can be quite stressful, and you know, we are sort of post-pandemic. There are global issues at the moment which are difficult and challenging. There's the whole sort of economic thing going on right now. You know, we're in an environment where there's a lot of stress. We are plugged into these things all the time, and we've got this constant sort of ping and ding of technology, and so it's really easy to live a life where you don't make any space to be quiet. So I think the first thing that's really important if you seek to be creative is to carve out a little bit of time just to be quiet. And whether that is in a sort of guided way with a bit of meditation, or taking the time to have a stroll around the park every day. There was a recent study that I read that found that people are 60% more creative, better at generating ideas when they're walking than when they're sitting behind a desk.
Really?
Yeah, and there's we have a default neural network in our brains. So scientists are beginning to understand that there are different modes of thinking, and analytical thinking is the kind of thinking we do when we're aware that we're thinking, when we sit down and consciously try and solve a problem. Spontaneous thinking, which is where the big original insights come from, happens in different regions of our brain outside of the prefrontal cortex. And it's why you often get an idea when when you're driving, or you're taking a shower, or you're doing the dishes, or you're in that sort of space between waking and sleeping. That's when our spontaneous thought is happening. So I'd encourage anybody who feels like they're not creative to begin not by worrying about having ideas, but just beginning to carve out some regular time when they get a bit of space, away with the phone switched off, and outside maybe. I run, that's my thing, and when I'm running, my brain just goes into this sort of quiet, restful mode, and that's when I often have great ideas. And then I think the second important thing is to begin quite small, And one of the big barriers that people often have is they go, well, I'm going to write a novel. and that's great. But, the idea of writing a novel when you've maybe not written anything since school is kind of bonkers, really, 100,000 words. And so people never get started. And the trick, I think, is to start really small. And so if somebody's thinking about writing a novel, I would say, well, just begin with a character's shoes. Start there, write about their shoes. And don't worry about anything else. There's a nice line that I've pinched, but attributed from the American writer E.L. Doctorow, and he says, writing's like driving a car at night. You only need to be able to see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole journey that way. And we're told, there's this phrase, you can't see the wood for the trees. And in the book, I say, don't worry about that. Just start with the tree, get up close to the tree, look at the bark, and often, the hardest thing with any creative journey is beginning. And so if you make that beginning as painless and as small and as easy as possible, then often you'll find that the rest of it just kind of flows.
Thank you. There's also lots of my listeners and viewers are in the world of flowers, and I know lots of them are beginners. And there's a really interesting part of the book where you talk about the different parts of your brain, the ones that analyze and the ones that are creative, and how you shouldn't analyze something while you're creating it. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So one of the most important things that I've learned about the creative process, having thought about it and explored it for the last few years, is that creativity and evaluation are different processes. So there's an amazing woman who is one of my heroes, and her name is Corita Kent, and she was a nun in Los Angeles. A convent is now where Katy Perry lives.
Oh my goodness!
celebrity trivia for you there.
Thank you.
Karita Kemp, an amazing woman. So she, you imagine that she made a lot of art, and you imagine a nun would make sort of quite austere, religious-based stuff, and she did these big, bold, colourful screen prints that have. They're about love, and they're about civil rights and stuff like this. And she became an art teacher, and she wrote 10 art department rules, which I've actually got hanging on my. Just hanging on my wall up here. There we go.
Okay. Wow.
They're brilliant. People could look them up online. Karita
Yes, I
Kemp.
will. Yeah, wow.
Rule number 8 is don't try to evaluate and analyze at the same time the different processes. And they happen in different parts of the brain. The executive center of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. And that's the sort of the grown-up, like non-reptilian parts of our brain that sort of evaluate, and it's really important for working out whether your ideas are any good. But as we've mentioned already, creativity often happens elsewhere. It's the brain, different regions of the brain networking together in spontaneous and unpredictable ways. So the trick when you're trying to come up with ideas is to get into a state of flow. So you've just got to get down as many ideas as you can, and just keep going on ideas. So pens are much better than computers, because you can scribble. I've always got loads of pieces of scrap when I'm coming up with ideas. There's a nice line by Thomas Edison who said, remember this, when you've exhausted all the possibilities, you haven't. And so you say, right, for half an hour, I'm just going to keep going. And it doesn't matter if my ideas are rubbish or if they feel derivative or any of this. I'm just going to keep going. And then you evaluate at the end. And if you start evaluating too soon, you're arresting the creative process, because you're stopping your brain doing the creative stuff. You're moving into a different region. And that's where it gets very difficult. There's from a business point of view, there's a research project that Harvard Business School have done a number of times, and they get a group of creative professionals together, and they give them a brief, them all the same brief, and then they divide the group into two, and they say to one half, you've got to come up with some ideas. We don't care if your ideas are good or not. Just come up with as many as you possibly can. It's all about quantity. And then they say to the other half of the group, here's your brief. We need a really good idea. So we don't need many ideas. We just need the best idea you can possibly come up with. Quality. And it's always the side who've been tasked with quantity over quality who come up with the best ideas, because that quality control filter is off and they're able to push on. Because the first ideas are often the most conventional, the easiest, Yeah. It's the really good stuff is further out there, and that's why you've got to keep pushing.
That really, really makes sense. Yeah. So when somebody comes to you and they had somebody come to them and say that they're not creative, how do you help them with that sort of self-doubt?
The first thing that it's really important to understand about self-doubt is that everybody experiences it.
That's reassuring.
One of the unfortunate things, I guess, is that fortunate, depending on your perspective, is that the only people's thoughts we can ever truly know about are our own, and so you look at other people and they seem like really confident and really successful, and like they effortlessly arrived at this wonderful thing that you could never do, and you just assume that it's all plain sailing. But what one discovers when one digs a little deeper into the biographies of some of these hugely successful people is that self-doubt is never far beneath the surface. So one of the examples I often cite is Michelangelo, one of the greats of art ever. You know, the roof of the Sistine Chapel. Most people would cite that as one of the 10 great artworks of all time. But when he was in the middle of painting it, he wrote in a poem to his mate, "My painting is dead. I'm not in the right place. I'm not an artist." And so I think there are many other examples, some of which I give in the book. But I think self-doubt is universal, and the more you kind of battle it, like so many things, like a lot of the demons I describe in the book, then the more power it acquires. And the trick, I think, is acceptance. This little nagging voice in your head is not ever gonna go away. Sometimes he's gonna be shouting with a loud hailer, so loud you can't hear anything else. We all experience that, in the dead of the night. And other times, maybe he's going to be so quiet that you can't hear him, but most of the time he's going to be there. So one of the things it's important to understand is that a little self-doubt can actually be a good thing. I think, it's a bit like Goldilocks and the porridge. Too much is crippling. Not enough means that you're becoming too bound up with your own self-importance. But a little bit is good because it makes you challenge yourself and ask critical questions. And that's really important in any creative endeavor. The Irish novelist Anne Enright said recently in an interview, only bad writers think that their writing is really good. So if self-doubt's completely disappeared, then you have a problem, because you will be too in love with your own ideas.
Yeah, I really, that quote that you just said then, and then the one also about driving and just being able to see what's in front of you, really resonated with me when I read the book.
Great.
Incredible. So can you share who were the most challenging demons for you when you wrote the book, when you actually physically writing the book? What did you struggle with?
Well, the constraints I've mentioned, so I like to write in the mornings. It just sort of works well for me, that, and I like it to be quiet. And when I write, I like to be uninterrupted. But we were homeschooling in the mornings, and my wife was looking after our eldest, and I was looking after the youngest, which meant the homeschooling for me was more rudimentary, but the interruptions were more frequent. So I had to write in the afternoon, and we had the builders in, and they were really noisy. They were nice builders, and they did a good job, but they were really bloody noisy. So that was the thing. And in the book, I speculate as to whether it would have been easier to write in a hilltop mountain retreat with a Buddhist monk who made good martinis. This at the time seemed to be a bit like the dream scenario. And I came to the conclusion that it probably wouldn't have been that much better, because in a way, constraints force us to be more creative. And what I had to do, because of my circumstances, was to be really focused on what I wanted to say in a given chapter, and to write in these short but quite intense bursts. And had I had endless time, then I probably would have procrastinated for much longer. So that was a thing. And then, beyond that, there's the sort of doubt. Is it good?
It's very, very good. It's so easy to read, and it's quite light-hearted, and it's just really, really easy to read. I love books that you read and you don't have to look up every second word to know what it means.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Hopefully, I tried to write it in a way that is as truthful to the way I talk and who I am as possible, really. And then I think it's I've read a lot of books similar, of a similar kind of ethos, not on the same subject necessarily, but of a similar kind of ethos. And there are quite a lot around. And generally I've found them either to be a bit dry and academic, or to be a bit sort of fluffy and self-centered. And it's rare, I think, to find a book where the anecdotes are sort of well judged and entertaining. There's enough science to make it feel like it's got a bit of substance to it without it being dry. And so I tried to write a kind of book that I would like to read, and that's probably quite a good goal to aim for, I think, when one is writing.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed it, hence why I invited you on the podcast. But I understand that you have plans for an online course. Is that right?
That is right, yes. And it is. So I've done a lot of workshops over the years to people in various places, but those require that I am in the same place as the people doing the workshops, or at least opposite a laptop at the same time. So I've created 3 courses, one of which will be going live very soon. And that's called How to Have Better Ideas. So it touches on a number of the things that we've talked about in this conversation: creativity versus evaluation, creativity as a state of mind, how to deal with the fear of failure, this kind of thing. And then there are anecdotes and examples throughout that. That will be going online shortly.
And who do you feel will be the kind of students that you have for that course?
Well, I would like to think that it is anybody who feels they would benefit from being more creative professionally, I would say, probably. But the course, I think the principles of creativity are fairly universal. One can get down to sort of granular execution in different media, and I do talk. I do work on copywriting, particularly because of my background. But the principles are universal, and I know from speaking to audiences of artists and copywriters and designers and all kinds of different people that they all run into the same hurdles and barriers and challenges. So that course is really intended to pick off some of those big universal challenges that we face when we're having better ideas, trying to have better ideas.
Cool. Talking of having ideas, I'd love your thoughts on the big conundrum, which is inspiration versus imitation. How do you deal with that, and what's your opinion on whether somebody's inspired by something or is actually imitating?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's one of the sort of thorniest issues, in creativity, that we are incapable as human beings of just creating in a vacuum. Everything that we create depends on our lived experience, but also our knowledge and understanding and appreciation of other works within the genre that we're working. And Isaac Newton famously said, he had that quote about standing on the shoulders of giants. If I've achieved anything, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And what I discovered in the research for the book is that he'd actually pinched that expression from a bloke called John of Salisbury. And John of Salisbury had pinched it from a guy called Bernard of Chartres. So the expression, which is about, deriving benefits from the endeavors of others, was actually, a borrowed expression. So I think it's really important to, if you seek to come up with ideas and to make great creative work, to expose yourself to the greatest works by others around, to expose yourself to great work. It's one of the ways we get topped up and inspired. That feeling when when you've been to a great art exhibition or something, and you come out and you start looking, you start seeing the world a bit differently. You notice something on the tube on the way home that you wouldn't have noticed if you'd not gone to that art exhibition. But there's a really important distinction between imitation and being inspired by something, you know, by copying something and by stealing it. And to steal is to take something and to make it your own. And I think that's the trick. You know, Jean-Luc Godard, the filmmaker, said it's not where you take things from, it's where you take things to. And so I think it's okay to be inspired by somebody else's ideas, but you must then advance it somehow. You know, bring some of your own truth to it. To make it substantively different to what has gone before. And so it's a legitimate sort of creative endeavor, really, to look at other examples of stuff, but you must move it on. And if you don't move it on, then you're just copying it. And if you copy it, then your creative soul will wither and die. There's a really lovely quote which people can find, a really lovely extract which people can find online of Steve Jobs being interviewed about theft. And he says in this, it's a really quite early interview, but he's wearing his black polo neck, and he says, "We've been shameless about stealing great ideas at Apple." And you watch this clip, it's like, but what he's not talking about is stealing ideas from Google or Samsung or any of these places. He's talking about the people who work at Apple exposing themselves to great poetry and history and literature and zoology. And he says, we're stealing ideas all the time, but from all these different genres. And then we're reinventing them in through the medium of design and computing. So yeah, I mean, I think we know, don't we? We know whether we've just nicked something and, you know, trotted it out in just a reworking of what went before, or we've taken something that really meant something to us and then reinterpreted it through our own experience. We ourselves, our conscience lets us know really whether we've been successful there.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a fine line, but yes, you're right. The gut will always tell you whether or not you feel comfortable in what you've done.
Yeah. And I think the really important thing to remember is that we don't notice things that we've seen a bunch of times before. You know, our brains are very good at editing out anything that seems familiar. And what really catches our eye as human beings, because it's how we're hardwired, is something new or different or unexpected. And so this is, when it comes to making a business, this is one of the values of creativity, that the more you do what everybody else does, the more forgettable you are. The more distinctive you attempt to be, the more likely you are to get noticed.
That is such a lovely way to end this conversation before your 3 tips. That's honestly, I'm so inspired by our conversation. Thank you so much, Richard.
No, you're very welcome. Yeah.
So what are I know you've shared so much valuable knowledge. Do you have 3 more tips?
Yeah, I do.
Great.
I do have 3 tips. So the first one is about convention and ties into what I was saying just now. Another of my creative heroes, alongside Karita Kent, is the musician and producer and artist Brian Eno, who himself is somebody who's very interested in the creative process. And in his diaries, which were republished recently, and I would encourage anybody curious about the creative process and a fan of Brian Eno to read, he talks about his mate, Peter Schmidt, the artist, coming to him, and they were talking about convention. And Peter Schmidt said, what if you don't do the things that nobody had never thought of not doing, which is like a real head scrambler. What if you don't do the things that nobody had never thought of not doing? In other words, in any genre, there are some things that people do as a matter of course. You know, they are the things that have always been done, so we will do those without thinking about them. And Peter Schmidt was saying, well, do those things always have to be done? And any major breakthrough in the field of creativity, or I would argue in the field of business, requires a fundamental sort of paradigm shift, and you dismantle those things. So, for instance, when Marcel Duchamp put a urinal in a gallery and signed it Art Mot, it created the foundation for conceptual art. But up until that point, it was thought that an artwork had to be created by the hand of an artist. And that's changed everything. A business example is, you know, when we think about cafes and restaurants, it was always assumed that a cafe or a restaurant needed a seating area. That was just one of the things. Seems obvious, doesn't it? But at some point in the 50s in America, somebody thought, well, what if we have a cafe or a restaurant without a seating area? Then it becomes a highly profitable, high margin, low cost drive-through, and the business model changes. So I think that's one is to question the things that you take for granted is a really great place to overcome convention. Second tip is about constraints, and I mentioned my own constraints, but we all face constraints. And one of the really interesting things about creativity research is it shows that the more constraints we face, the more creative we are. And there's a lovely story. I don't think, maybe I mentioned it in the book, but again, people can find a video of this online. If you look at the Prison Da Vinci on Vimeo, it's a little anecdote about the life of Chris Wilson, who's a British artist who grew up in America. He's an extraordinary artist and a really tough time. Got into drugs, spent a lot of time in jail, and when he was in jail, he felt this irresistible urge to paint. But he was I think he was in Rikers Island, like real tough New York jail, and they wouldn't give him any materials. So he discovered that you can make paint from M&M sweets, and he would get similar colors of sweets, wash them down, mix the ink that came off them with a bit of toothpaste, and then make paintings. And I think it's such a lovely story that you know, too often we kid ourselves that the constraints we face mean that we can't do the thing we want to do. I haven't got enough time, I haven't got enough money, I couldn't possibly do it, I haven't got the right qualifications. And these are really just procrastination by another name, you know. So that would be a thing, really, is not to accept your constraints as all limiting. And then finally, the fear of failure. You know, if there's anything that's going to stop us being creative, it's the fear of failure. And there's a lovely book, which I happen to have over here, by Catherine Schultz. It's a bit bright in here, but it's called Being Wrong.
Okay.
Adventures in the Margin of Error. And she does a great TED talk, which people can watch for free without buying the book, but the book's really nice. She talks about the tiny, terrified space of rightness. So that we don't like, when we're kids, we will look for the green ticks rather than the red crosses. You know, we're taught that a mistake is a mistake and mistakes are wrong. And so we get squeezed into the tiny, terrified space of rightness, which is a space where everything is just as we thought it should be, and there are no risks taken. And I think if you want to be creative, you've got to accept that you're going to fail, because you have to take risks. And if you keep taking risks, sooner or later you fail. And so if you're not failing, then you're not taking enough risks to be creative. And the point I make in the book is that who's to say a failure is a failure anyway? And often the things in my life that have seemed to be big failures, I've often turned out to be the moments where I got put on a path that was much truer to who I am. And we've probably run out of time, but there's for another time. This, my own business didn't work out in the end as I had hoped it would, and had that not happened, I wouldn't be doing what I am doing today. And I feel much more fulfilled doing what I do today than dealing with investors and spreadsheets and all that stuff, and there's a nice quote, which is probably a good place to finish, which is from Miles Davis. And I think jazz is really interesting. Jazz and creativity is a fascinating area in itself. But Miles Davis says, it's not the note you play that's the wrong note. It's the note you play afterwards that makes it right or wrong. And that to me is extremely wise.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard. They were brilliant tips, and I'm sure they'll resonate with so many listeners and viewers. So tell us where people can find you online and where they can buy your book.
Yeah, so my website is richardholman.com, and there's a bunch of blog articles there, and people can sign up and get a mailer that I put out once a month, usually with one article and a bunch of other stuff. I am on Instagram and Twitter, and I'm also on LinkedIn as Richard Holman, and more businessy stuff goes up on there, so people can follow me there too.
And where can people buy your book?
Well, theoretically, from the place they buy their books. Published by Thames and Hudson, so it's available from their website at Amazon and Book Depository and Waterstones and the usual places.
Great. Super. Well, I don't really want to finish talking to you, but I need to because we were over an hour. Thank you so much for your time today, and good luck with the book and also the online course.
Thank you very much, Ron. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully people have found some useful things.
I'm sure they have. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So I hope you've enjoyed my interview with Richard as much as I enjoyed interviewing him. Do head over to his website and Instagram, and if you'd like yet more inspiration, then make sure to get a copy of his book, Creative Demons.